black columns of smoke rose against the cold Pacific horizon on the morning of July 30th, 1865. The steamship, Brother Jonathan, heavy with passengers, gold, and railroad equipment, had just struck the hidden ledges of St. George Reef. The storm was merciless. Waves tore through the hull as the captain tried to turn back toward Crescent City. There were enough lifeboats for everyone, but not enough time. In 45 minutes, the ship was gone. 244 people had been aboard. Only 19 survived. The reef had claimed its tribute. And humanity was forced to answer the question, how do you tame a dragon of rock and water? Eight miles northwest of Crescent City, California, the Pacific does not look dramatic at first glance. It looks wide, cold, gray. But just beneath and just above the surface, the ocean breaks against a chain of jagged outcroppings known as St. George Reef. In 1792, Captain George Vancouver gave those rocks a name that still feels disturbingly accurate: the Dragon Rocks. The nearest point of land he called Point Saint. George, as if naming the shore might one day tame the beast offshore. But the dragon was never slain. It waited, low, black, and patient, where swells from the open Pacific gathered force before slamming into stone. Stand there in your imagination. No harbor. No shelter. Just rock rising from deep water, exposed to every storm rolling in from the west. Waves do not simply meet these rocks, they attack them. They explode upward in white fury, climb the ledges, and crash back into the sea. For decades in the 19th century, ships traveling the busy coastal route between San Francisco and the Pacific Northwest passed dangerously close to this reef. There were no lights, no warning beacons, only charts, judgment, and luck. On July 30th, 1865, just 3 months after the Civil War ended, that luck ran out. The steam-side wheeler Brother Jonathan had departed San Francisco carrying 244 people, passengers, crew, businessmen, families, and children. She was also heavy with cargo, railroad equipment, mining supplies, and a significant shipment of gold, including coins from the San Francisco Mint. The ship encountered severe weather along the northern California coast. By Sunday morning, she reached Crescent City Harbor, seeking temporary refuge from the storm. That afternoon, despite rough seas, she attempted to continue north. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. Near the California-Oregon border, the storm intensified. Realizing the danger, the captain made the decision to turn back toward Crescent City. But the decision came too late. At approximately 4:30 p.m., the Brother Jonathan struck St. George Reef. The impact tore open her hull. Water rushed in. There were lifeboats on board, enough for those aboard. But there was not enough time. In the chaos of wind, rain, and pounding surf, only 3 boats were successfully lowered. 2 were destroyed in the violent seas almost immediately. Within 45 minutes of striking the reef, the ship was gone. 244 people had been aboard that vessel. Only 19 survived. 19. The rest, men, women, children, were claimed by the reef. Along with them sank the gold, the cargo, and the confidence of a nation that believed progress and steam power could master the coastline. In the days and years that followed, stories circulated of treasure beneath the waves. Decades later, when the wreck was located and salvaged, those stories proved true. Civil War-era coins and a chest of $20 gold pieces were recovered from the ocean floor. The gold had been real. So was the loss. The disaster of the brother Jonathan was not a minor maritime accident. It was one of the worst shipwrecks on the Pacific coast at the time. It exposed, with brutal clarity, the lethal vulnerability of that reef. It forced lawmakers, mariners, and citizens to confront an uncomfortable truth. This was not an unpredictable fluke. The Dragon rocks had been there long before the ship, and they would be there long after. Two years later, in 1867, the United States Lighthouse Board formally requested funds from Congress to build a lighthouse on St. George Reef. The argument was clear. Ships were traveling heavily between San Francisco and the Pacific Northwest. Commerce was expanding. Another tragedy was not a question of if, it was a question of when. But the nation was exhausted. The Civil War had ended in April of 1865. It had cost over 600,000 lives and billions of dollars in modern terms. Railroads needed rebuilding. Cities in the South lay in ruins. The federal treasury was strained. Constructing a lighthouse 8 miles offshore on an exposed rock in the Pacific Ocean would require a massive investment, one that lawmakers were unwilling to approve. So Congress refused. The reef remained dark. The Dragon remained undefeated. For years, St. George Reef stood as a silent indictment, a known killer left unwarned. Ships continued to pass. Mariners relied on skill and prayer. The memory of the brother Jonathan lingered, but memory alone does not pour concrete or set stone. Then, in 1881, something changed. That year, Oregon's Tillamook Rock Lighthouse, built on an isolated rock in equally violent seas, was completed. It was proof that a lighthouse could, in fact, be constructed on a wave-battered outcropping. Proof that engineering could challenge geography. Proof that isolation was not impossibility. Suddenly, St. George Reef was no longer an engineering fantasy. It was a political decision. In 1882, Congress appropriated $50,000, not to build, but to survey. Alexander Ballantyne, an experienced engineer, was authorized to visit St. George Reef and examine Northwest Seal Rock, the outermost and most suitable formation for a foundation. His conclusion was direct. It could be done. In 1883, an additional $100,000 was allocated to begin construction. The fight with the Dragon had officially begun. In early April 1883, the schooner La Ninfa was towed to the reef. It did not serve as transport alone. It became barracks, mess hall, shelter. It was moored to 4 buoys and secured at 2 anchor points on the rock itself. This vessel would be home for the men attempting what many still considered madness. There was no dock, no pier, no safe landing. A cable was stretched from the schooner to the top of the rock. Suspended from it was a small platform. The workers rode that platform back and forth between ship and stone, like a primitive zip line over open Pacific water. When waves surged and threatened to sweep across the rock, the men lashed their tools to iron rings drilled into the stone. Then they climbed onto the suspended platform and retreated to the schooner until the sea calmed. This was not a construction site. This was combat. Powerful explosives were brought in to blast away the uneven crown of the rock. After lighting the fuse, Valentine would shout, "Fire in the hole!" The men would scramble, diving into natural crevices in the rock, hunting holes like crabs, as one account described it, while fragments of shattered stone rained down around them. At times, debris reached the schooner itself. By September 1883, they had carved a terraced surface into the rock, a place where a foundation could begin. But then the enemy changed. It was no longer just the sea. It was money. For the 1884 work season, Congress appropriated only $30,000 instead of the requested $150,000. In 1885, funding rose to just $40,000. In 1886, nothing was allocated at all. 3 consecutive years of financial instability. During those years, work slowed to quarrying granite onshore near Humboldt Bay, finishing stones at a depot, and performing minimal maintenance at the reef. The district engineer expressed open frustration in his report, stating that beginning such a project without sufficient funds during the short, favorable season was nearly useless. The ocean does not pause for budget negotiations. Every winter, storms damaged what little progress had been made. Each spring, repairs had to come before advancement. Then in March of 1887, Congress finally committed real support. $120,000 was appropriated with additional funding promised for subsequent seasons. Now the true construction began. Granite quarried near the Mad River was transported by rail to Humboldt Bay, shaped precisely, then loaded onto ships and delivered to the reef. From there, derricks with a 90-foot boom lifted the stones into place. The structure they were building was not simply a tower. It began with an elliptical caisson, a massive pier designed to withstand direct assault from waves. Within it would be an engine room, coal room, and a 77,000-gallon cistern to collect rainwater. The numbers are staggering. By 1889, the pier contained 1,339 dressed granite stones laid in 21 courses. Some individual blocks weighed as much as 6 tons. Each stone was cut so precisely that the joint between it and its neighbor required no more than 3/16 of an inch. Precision in a place of chaos. At times, as many as 52 men worked on the rock simultaneously. Once quarters were constructed directly on the reef, they no longer had to retreat nightly to the schooner. They lived there, surrounded by water, isolated from shore, subject to the temper of the Pacific. Ships delivered granite night and day when conditions allowed. If stone was ready to be set, laborers worked Sundays. Time mattered. Weather windows were short, and the sea was always watching. Not all battles were won without loss. On June 16, 1891, a worker holding a tagline attached to the boom was swept over the pier by a wave and fell to his death. Another near tragedy occurred in 1889 when a massive wave smashed into the crew's quarters at 2 a.m, washing several men from their bunks. Construction did not pause. By May 13, 1891, The first stone of the tower itself was set in place. By the end of August that same year, the tower stood complete. The lantern room and spiral staircase, manufactured by the Phoenix Iron Company of Trenton, New Jersey, were installed. Although the masonry was finished in 1891, the Fresnel lens from France did not arrive until 1892. 7 years of active construction. 17 years since Congress first refused. 27 years since the brother Jonathan struck the reef. Stone by stone, blast by blast, dollar by dollar, the United States had answered the dragon. This was not simply architecture. It was resolve. It was grief transformed into granite. It was a fortress cut from the exposed edge of a continent. On October 20th, 1892, after nearly a decade of construction and 27 years after the wreck of the brother Jonathan, St. George Reef Lighthouse finally came alive. The tower stood firm on its granite caisson, anchored to a rock that had swallowed 244 lives in 1865, but on that night, something new rose above the Pacific. A first-order Fresnel lens, manufactured in France by Henry Lapote, had arrived after months of delay. It was no ordinary lantern. The lens contained 15 flash panels. Every other panel was fitted with ruby glass, producing alternating red and white flashes. The sequence was deliberate. The interval was precise. 15 seconds between characteristic signals. The beam could be seen for more than 20 miles across open water. More than 20 miles. For ships traveling the dark coastal route between San Francisco and the Pacific Northwest, that light meant one thing: warning before impact. It meant distance. It meant time to turn. The San Francisco Chronicle declared that the structure was so strongly built that the tremendous waves striking it might as well be ripples in a brook. But those who would live there knew better. Because while the light was engineered with mathematical precision, the life behind it would never be simple. St. George Reef Lighthouse quickly gained a reputation within the lighthouse service. Not as an honor post, but as one of the least desirable assignments on the Pacific coast. 5 keepers were typically assigned to the station. Their rotation was structured: 3 months on the reef, followed by 2 months ashore in Crescent City with their families. That schedule sounds manageable on paper. In reality, it tested men to their limits. The tower stood 8 miles offshore, fully exposed to Pacific storms. There was no casual resupply, no quick return to shore. Mail and fresh provisions depended entirely on weather conditions. If seas were too violent for transfer, the men stayed put. Isolation was constant, so wind was constant, or the sound of waves striking granite was constant, and the mind does not always endure constancy well. In October 1895, tragedy struck again. First Assistant Keeper William Erickson departed the reef in the station's boat, bound for Crescent City. He never arrived. Neither man nor vessel was ever found. The official Lighthouse Board report stated that no vestige of man or boat was discovered. The reef had claimed again, this time not in spectacle but in silence. And the years continued. Storms regularly battered the structure. On rare but documented occasions, waves rose high enough and 70 feet above sea level to sweep across the top of the caisson itself. Water did not merely crash against the base. It climbed. It reached. It wrapped around the tower. During severe storms, water entered the lantern room approximately 145 feet above the sea. It cascaded down the central spiral staircase like a waterfall. Imagine standing watch in that tower while the ocean pours down the stairs from above. In 1896, a framed blacksmith shop atop the pier was destroyed by a storm. On December 7, 1923, enormous seas broke onto the pier with such force that the donkey engine house was torn from its foundation and slid across the deck. The tower trembled. The men inside wondered during those long nights whether granite and mortar would hold. And still the light had to remain lit. Water for the steam whistle in daily life was collected from rainfall on top of the elliptical pier and stored in a 77,000-gallon cistern. Rainfall, however, was not always sufficient. In 1895, to conserve water, the silent interval between the whistle's 5-second blasts was increased from 35 seconds to 75 seconds. Even the fog signal had to ration itself. But perhaps the greatest strain was not structural. It was psychological. Georges Roux served longer than any other keeper on the reef. He arrived as second assistant in 1910 and remained until 1939, spending over 20 years in charge of the lighthouse. In 1937, Roux and his assistants were trapped on the tower for 59 consecutive days due to relentless storms. 59 days, no rotation, no shore leave, no relief. After 4 weeks, Roux later recalled, the men had exhausted every possible conversation. Words became irritations. Casual remarks became personal offenses. They were solid friends, yet proximity without escape strained even friendship. Near the end of that confinement, when they opened cans of beans for meals and ate them cold, they deliberately faced away from one another, not speaking, not looking, simply enduring each other's presence. The storm eventually passed. The weather cleared, and as Roux said, they returned to being fast friends again, talking their heads off. But that episode revealed something profound. The ocean does not only attack the body, it tests the mind. The keepers at St. George Reef were not merely guardians of a light. They were participants in an experiment of endurance. They confronted storms powerful enough to lift buildings, waves capable of smashing steel and glass, and a silence heavy enough to fracture thought. The red and white flashes that could be seen for more than 20 miles were steady, predictable, reassuring. Life inside the tower was none of those things. Between 1892 and 1950, generations of men stood watch on that rock. Some resigned, some transferred. 4 died in the course of service over the decades. The reef remained what it had always been, unforgiving. But something had changed. It no longer ruled unchallenged. By the spring of 1951, St. George Reef Lighthouse had already endured nearly 6 decades of relentless exposure to the Pacific. Built to prevent disaster, it had faced waves that climbed 70 feet above sea level and storms strong enough to shake granite. Since 1939, the United States Coast Guard had assumed control of the nation's lighthouses, and the men stationed on the reef were no longer civilian keepers but enlisted servicemen. The uniform had changed, but the danger had not. The rock still stood 8 miles offshore, fully exposed, dependent on weather windows for transfer and vulnerable to the unpredictable violence of the sea. On April 5th, 1951, 5 Coast Guardsmen prepared to depart the station. Bertram Beckett and Wilbur Walker, both electricians' mates, had completed repair work and were scheduled to return to shore. They were joined by a 3-man crew consisting of Stanley Costello, Ross Vandenberg, and Thomas Mulcahy. The procedure for departure was well established. The station's launch would be lowered by boom toward the water below. Timing was critical, and the surf had to be judged carefully. That day, as the boat descended toward the foaming surface, nothing initially suggested catastrophe. Then, without warning, the sea shifted. A rogue wave, steep and violent, struck the launch as it neared the waterline. The impact flooded the boat instantly. The sudden weight strained the lifting cables beyond their limit. A metal ring securing one of the supporting lines tore loose under pressure. The boat dropped sharply, and within seconds all 5 men were thrown into the frigid Pacific. The water temperature was unforgiving, the current swift, and the reef beneath them merciless. From the tower above, Officer in charge, Fred Permenter, responded immediately. He ordered the damaged launch raised back toward the platform and retrieved an inflatable raft from it. The raft was cast into the turbulent water below. Then Permenter made a decision that would define the day. From a height of approximately 20 feet, he jumped into the ocean and swam toward the raft amid heavy seas. He reached Beckett and Walker and struggled to secure them to flotation. Meanwhile, Mulcahy and Vandenberg fought through the surf and managed to cling to a nearby mooring buoy. Stanley Costello, however, did not resurface. A commercial fishing vessel named Winga, alerted by Coast Guard radio, arrived at the scene and recovered the 2 men from the buoy, as well as Permenter and the 2 unconscious electricians' mates from the raft. After a brief search, Costello's body was located. Artificial respiration was administered to Beckett during the hurried return to Crescent City, but upon arrival at medical facilities, Beckett, Walker, and Costello were pronounced dead. 3 lives lost in a matter of minutes. Fred Permenter had been in charge of the lighthouse for less than 1 month when the accident occurred. For his courageous attempt to rescue his fellow servicemen, he was awarded the Gold Life-Saving Medal, one of the nation's highest honors for maritime rescue. Yet no commendation could soften the weight of April 5, 1951. The tower built to prevent tragedy had witnessed it once more, and the Pacific had claimed 3 additional lives under the beam of its own warning light. If the sea attacked the body, isolation attacked the mind. Life at St. George Reef, during the Coast Guard era, followed a rotation intended to balance duty and relief. Commonly, 10 days on the rock, followed by 10 days ashore. In practice, weather frequently disrupted those schedules. Storms delayed relief crews. Transfers were postponed. Supplies and mail depended entirely on navigable seas. Young servicemen, often barely out of their teens, found themselves confined to a granite outcrop 8 miles from shore with little privacy, limited diversion, and no escape when the weather closed in. In August 1951, only 4 months after the fatal accident, another crisis unfolded inside the barracks. Roland Bechtel, a Coast Guardsman assigned to the station, experienced a severe mental breakdown. He went berserk, destroying furniture and damaging equipment within the quarters. This was not simple frustration, but a psychological fracture under strain. Bechtel was removed from the lighthouse and placed in the Del Norte County Jail for safekeeping until commanding officers determined a course of action. 2 days later, he was escorted to Alameda to receive hospital treatment. The reef had not taken his life, but it had nearly overwhelmed his mind. Later that same year, in November 1951, 3 Coast Guardsmen left the station without authorization. Conrad A., Womack, Leland A., Barber, and Richard W. Simmons departed together in what appeared to be a coordinated and premeditated act. Each day following their absence, the station logbook recorded precisely how many days, hours, and minutes the trio had been absent without leave. The entries continued with measured accuracy. After 30 days, the men were officially declared deserters. The ocean had not touched them, yet isolation had. The reef demanded resilience not only against crashing waves, but against silence, repetition, and confinement. It required mental endurance equal to physical courage. By the early 1950s, St. George Reef Lighthouse had witnessed construction deaths, unexplained disappearances, structural destruction from storms, fatal accidents, psychological collapse, and desertion. Through all of it, the light continued its steady rhythm every 15 seconds, red and white alternating across more than 20 miles of open water. Predictable, precise, unwavering. Inside the tower, however, the human experience was anything but steady. The tragedy of April 5th exposed the raw physical power of the sea. The breakdown in August and the desertions in November revealed another force equally dangerous. Isolation can erode judgment. Confinement can distort thought. Loneliness can weaken discipline as surely as waves can tear steel from stone. At St. George Reef, men confronted storms that rose from the Pacific, and they also confronted storms within themselves. The lighthouse stood as a fortress of granite, engineered to resist water and wind, yet no masonry could fully shield those inside from psychological strain. The Pacific was immense and violent, but the human mind under relentless isolation could be just as fragile. That is the enduring lesson of 1951. Not only that 3 Coast Guardsmen were lost to a rogue wave, but that even within a tower built to defy the sea, the most perilous battles can occur unseen. St. George Reef Lighthouse stood firm against water and storm. Yet within its walls, men struggled with forces that left scars no less real than those carved by the ocean. By 1975, St. George Reef Lighthouse had stood against the Pacific for 83 years. It had been lit for the first time on October 20th, 1892. It had survived rogue waves, construction deaths, disappearances, wartime service, Coast Guard control, and the tragedy of April 5th, 1951. Granite had held. The Fresnel lens had flashed red and white every 15 seconds across more than 20 miles of open ocean. But technology was changing. In 1975, a large navigational buoy was placed near the reef. It was automated. It did not require a crew. It did not need rotating shifts, rainwater cisterns, or men willing to endure isolation 8 miles offshore. The buoy represented efficiency. It represented modernization. It also marked the end of an era. On May 13, 1975, Chief Petty Officer James W. Sebastian made the final entry in the station's logbook. His words were not mechanical. They were not procedural. They were deeply human. After 83 years, he wrote, "St. George Reef light is dark. No longer would its brilliant beam be seen. No longer would its fog signal bellow to warn mariners." He concluded with a line that carried both resignation and reverence. "May Mother Nature show you mercy. You have been abandoned, but never will you be forgotten." And then the light went out. There are moments in history that do not arrive with noise. They arrive with silence. May 13th, 1975 was one of those moments. For the first time since 1892, the tower stood in darkness. The dragon was no longer opposed by a living flame. For years afterward, the structure weathered the elements alone. Paint peeled, metal corroded, windows deteriorated. The lantern room leaked. The boom that once lowered boats to the water decayed. What had cost more than $700,000 in the 19th century, more than the Statue of Liberty, was left to the wind. But abandonment did not mean extinction. In 1988, a group of local citizens formed the St. George Reef Lighthouse Preservation Society. The federal government had planned to dispose of the lighthouse as scrap. Instead, Del Norte County obtained ownership and later leased the structure to the Preservation Society for $1 per month. $1. It was not a symbolic gesture. It was a responsibility. The volunteers were not wealthy investors. They were fishermen, tradesmen, retirees. Many were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. They flew by helicopter to the reef because there was no other safe access. Each flight cost thousands of dollars. Every visit required coordination with weather, insurance, and aviation regulations. They brought generators, tools, paint, replacement steel. They hauled out rotted furniture. They removed bird waste. They rebuilt rusted railings. In the spring of 2000, they undertook one of the most dramatic restoration efforts in the lighthouse's history. The deteriorated lantern room was removed from the top of the tower and suspended beneath a helicopter for transport to shore. As the aircraft approached land, it came in too low. The lantern room crashed onto the beach. Miraculously, the damage was not catastrophic. A local firm, Fashion Blacksmith, used the original dome to construct a new lantern room. In 2001, it was returned to the tower. On October 20th, 2002, exactly 110 years after the first lighting, St. George Reef Lighthouse was relit as a private aid to navigation. The beam did not last long before mechanical issues intervened, yet restoration continued. On March 10th, 2012, the lighthouse was activated again. The effort did not stop there. In June 2021, the Preservation Society signed a new 25-year lease agreement with Del Norte County, replacing an earlier agreement that had expired in 2020. Helicopter tours, once suspended in 2012 due to aviation objections, regained insurance approval in 2021. The commitment to preservation endured. The light had gone dark in 1975, but the memory of what it represented had not. And so we come to the final meaning of St. George Reef. Historically, it remains one of the most dangerous and expensive lighthouses ever constructed in the United States. Built between 1883 and 1892, at a cost exceeding $721,000, it required 1,339 dressed granite blocks, some weighing 6 tons, set with precision joints of no more than 3/16 of an inch. It rose from a reef that had claimed 244 lives. In 1865, it stood through wars, storms, and technological shifts. But history alone does not define it. People do. The workers who blasted the rock and dove into crevices when explosives ignited. The keeper William Erickson, who vanished without a trace in 1895. The men who endured 59 days of confinement in 1937. The 3 Coast Guardsmen lost to a rogue wave in 1951. Fred Permenter, who jumped into violent seas to save his fellow servicemen. The volunteers who risked flights and finances decades later to prevent the tower from collapsing into oblivion. Stone does not sacrifice. People do. And beyond history and people lies symbolism. Saint George Reef is not merely rock and mortar. It is will. It is sacrifice. It is persistence against forces larger than ourselves. The dragon is still there. The reef still waits beneath the swells 8 miles offshore. The Pacific has not softened. Waves still strike granite. Storms still test steel, but the tower stands. It stands because in 1865 a tragedy demanded action. It stands because in 1883 men believed stone could answer the sea. It stands because in 1975 someone wrote words that refused to let memory fade. It stands because in 1988 others refused to let it be dismantled. The light may go dark. Technology may replace flame. Crews may depart. But memory remains. And so we say, as those final words once declared, "You have been abandoned, but you will never be forgotten." Finally, thank you for being here and sharing this journey with me. If this story meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you'd consider liking, sharing, or following the channel so you can join me for the next chapter. And if a lighthouse has touched your life in any way, I truly enjoy reading your story in the comments. Until then, I look forward to seeing you in the next episode of Lighthouse Detective. Goodbye. See you again